Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to part 3 of my mini-series here on the Isolated Queen's Pawn within my Top 10 Middle Game Ideas series. The Isolated Queen's Pawn was idea number 2. I wanted to continue looking at the Isolated Queen's Pawn, but take a look at it from the black point of view this time. And the first game I wanted to show you was a game it was a correspondence game played in 1936 between Dimitriescu with the white pieces and Nagy with the black pieces. So white started off with c4. Black went e6, now d4, d5. And this is a standard position in the Queen's Gambit declined. Normally you'd reach it with d4, d5, c4, e6, and that makes it clear that white has offered the gambit and black has declined it by playing e6. So just a standard Queen's Gambit declined. White plays knight c3, which is the main move here, and black plays the move c5. And this move is known as the Tarrasch defense, c5 right in this position. And it's a very interesting way to play, particularly if, as black, you're interested in looking for a dynamic counterattacking alternative to the more classical defenses to the Queen's Gambit, where you have to kind of play defense for a while and suffer. And with the c5, you're immediately counterattacking the center, and it leads to very interesting play. I'm not going to say much about the Tarrasch defense, but I just wanted to make one little point here. After c takes d5, e takes d5, a lot of white players will just take the pawn here, particularly if they don't know the theory of this opening. And it looks like they're threatening to win the d-pawn, but you can push the d-pawn forward to e4. And in fact, I think they can win it if you take time out to grab the c-pawn. But what you do is after d takes c5, you push this d-pawn forward and just play it as a gambit. You win a tempo on this knight, you develop your pieces, you have this far advanced pawn which hinders white's development, and you get really excellent compensation, and black does well in most of those lines. So that's just a little bit of how to play the Tarrasch. We're going to see the standard line here. White ignores this possibility for a long time. Basically, eventually white plays that move, but he needs to complete his development, get his pieces organized before it's really safe for him to allow this gambit line. And in fact, we'll see the gambit line anyway in this game. So black continues with knight to c6, just logically piling up pressure on the d4 point. He's put the pawn here and now the knight here in this counterattack against the center. White goes for a fianchetto setup. He knows eventually there's going to be an isolated pawn here on d5, and he's preparing to develop the bishop to that diagonal to get some pressure against it. So knight f6, defending the center here in advance. Bishop g2, bishop e7, and all of these moves are the main line. Castles, castles, and now there's two moves here that white plays. Probably the top choice is bishop g5, continuing to leave the tension in the center and getting the bishop outside the pawn chain here in case of later e3. And then the move that's played in this game, d takes c5. At this point, it's actually safe to take that pawn, and black also has a choice between getting the pawn back immediately, taking back, or pushing the d-pawn forward, which is the way that it's played in this game. And this should result in a position that's playable for both sides. White's got a pawn, and white is down. White has grabbed a pawn, but his pieces are going to get kicked around a little bit, and black develops his pieces actively, gets them on good squares. We get bishop to d2, bishop to e4. Black is already trying to trade off this light squared bishop here before it becomes too dangerous. This knight jumps to h4, which is a little bit, kind of going along with black's wishes a little bit, but this is still okay for white. After this exchange, black plays knight to e4. Cancel that. Knight to e4, hopping into this square with the knight. And now white makes the mistake that actually loses the game. he plays the move queen to c2. And if you want to treat this as a tactical puzzle here, maybe you can figure out the move that black plays. There's one more move in the game, and then white resigns. But the combination is pretty deep. But if you want to pause the video here and see if you can figure out the move. Okay, what black played here is d3. Now, if you were looking at forcing moves, this should have been on your radar because it's attacking the queen. So it's very forcing. And it's also threatening to take this pawn, which comes with a tempo on the rook, which is also important in this line. So if the queen takes the pawn, let's talk about the simplest ideas first. If the queen takes the pawn, then queen takes, pawn takes, and then knight takes bishop. This bishop was loose here on e2 after the queens are traded. And the knight can escape if it gets chased. For example, with the rook, it has the escape through the square f3 because this pawn push to d3 has distracted that e-pawn from defending the f3 square. So the knight is not, white is not trapping the knight. So knight is safe and black is just a piece up. So that's kind of a simple line. What else? What if the queen just moves away? If the queen moves away, then you can take advantage of the fact that, let's cancel. Let's go to this square. You can take advantage of the fact that when you grab this pawn on e2, you're attacking the rook. And at the same time, now both the knight and the queen are coordinating on the bishop. So two pieces are hanging, and white can't save both of them. If he saves the rook, he loses the bishop, and vice versa. So he loses a piece in that line. So the last possibility here, you're thinking, what about pawn takes pawn? Surely that holds everything. But pawn takes pawn creates a new problem. So why don't you see if you can spot the tactic from this point now, having exhausted the other possibilities? What does black have that's good in this position? Okay, I'm going to give the answer away now. Pause the video if you want some time to think about it. It's this move, knight to d4. It comes with tempo on the bishop, on the queen rather. Knight's hitting the queen, and that's more important than the fact that this knight is under attack at the moment. He's got to do something about the queen. If he drops back straight away, then knight to e2 is a fork of the king and the queen. So the queen goes here. Now this knight needs to move because it's under attack, but it moves with tempo by trading off the bishop. And if the queen takes back, this is the key idea. The knight hops into f3 with the fork of the king and the queen. So if we wind that combination back, there's no way out. After knight d4, hitting the queen, if the queen goes somewhere else, which is not defending the bishop, the knight is just going to take the bishop, and once again, black will be a piece up. So the queen goes somewhere to defend the bishop, and then after knight takes, the queen can't take back, basically, because of the fork on f3. And if he tries to move the rook, the rook can't even be saved, because the knight comes here to f3 and will win the exchange. So black will be rook up in that case. So just winning. So it's this position here. The move d3 is an example of pushing the isolated queen's pawn forward and using that to disrupt your opponent and break through for the win. A common idea with these isolated queen's pawn positions, and you should always look for that in cases where your pawn is not blockaded. And notice what the pawn push does. It first of all deflected this e-pawn away from the f3 square so that we had forks on f3. That's one thing it did. The second thing it did was it vacated the square. It vacated the square d4, so the knight could use that square, hop into d4 with a tempo on the queen. So always when you think about these pawn pushes, you can think about the things they do, the pieces they attack as they move forward. Also think about the lines that open up, diagonal lines for the bishops or squares for the knights. Think about lines and squares that those pawns open up when you push them forward, and that's one of the keys to playing with the isolated queen's pawn. Okay, let's take a look at the next game here. This game was played in 1974 between two players, Radulov and Spasov, that I've never really heard of. Let's go forward to move 9 here. This is the same position we saw in the previous game. This is the Tarrasch defense again. Black is playing the Tarrasch defense to the queen's gambit. White once again chooses to take the pawn here. We'll see some examples of bishop g5 following this. So this time, in the previous game, black pushed on with d4, and we saw that was pretty interesting. In this game, black played bishop takes c5. And we're going to get a position where this isolated queen's pawn stays here on d5 for a long time. So the knight comes out to harass the bishop. The bishop drops back. And we're going to see some maneuvering. I'm not going to comment on every move, but just point out that white is restraining this pawn. And after bishop to g4, plants the knight in front of it. So it's pretty firmly blockaded at this point. It's not going to be able to push forward and disrupt. But there are other aspects to the isolated queen's pawn, as we saw, mainly that it creates these squares here and here that black can use for his pieces. And watch how this gets employed in the game. Knight e5, cancel that. Knight to e5. Okay, it's heading for the other square. Knight to e4 there, it might just get taken off immediately, and he's not ready to trade pieces just yet. Knight e5, h3 kicking the bishop. Bishop drops back. Knight to c3. This knight wasn't doing anything over on the rim, so it gets back into the game. This knight hops to c4. So this knight took this route. It went to c6, to e5, and now over to c4. And this looks like a great square where it's exerting influence here. White doesn't want to give up the bishop pair just yet, drops the bishop back. Rook to c8, an active placement of the pieces. The king goes to h2, defending the pawns over here in case there's pressure on the h-pawn. Bishop to b4, leaning on the knight a little bit. The knight drops back to b1. With the bishop and the rook both looking at that knight. This knight is in the way right now, but there's a possibility of black just winning a pawn on c3 there if this knight weren't in the way. Anyway, so white is rearranging his pieces here. This knight now hops into e4. So we get both knights on these squares that are afforded. These are landing spots that are afforded by the isolated queen's pawn. It protects those squares and gives them over to black for the maneuvers with his pieces. Now white can kick those pieces back, and we'll see that. The move b3. This knight drops back to d6, a good central location. And so that's another theme that white can push pieces away from these good squares using pawn moves, but it can leave behind weaknesses. Now this one is probably not a weakness because this bishop is looking pretty good on b2 here. The queen, not afraid of that bishop, runs out to f6, placing itself in the path of the bishop. But the bishop is not defended there, so there's no discovered attacks on the queen unless this knight can move with check or something. So queen f6 is safe. This queen came forward to d3, leaning on the knight a little bit, but rook to e1, defending the knight. And now f3. And this is the critical turning point in the game. White has made another pawn move, trying to push another piece off of a good square. And this is the moment when black strikes. So once again, if you're tactically inclined and feel like searching this position for tactics, what's a good move here? Okay, I'm going to give the answer away now. Black played knight takes g3. So this pawn was no longer defended by another pawn because of the f-pawn push. When this pawn came forward, it left the g3 pawn undefended, and the only piece that could take back is the king. If the king doesn't take back, first of all, black is just up a piece, but secondly, his king side is weakened, and there's a big threat of the queen coming to f4 and setting up a discovered attack. So if the king can't, the king has to really take the knight, is what I mean to say. If he doesn't take the knight, he's just losing without much of a fight. So the biggest attempt to put up a fight is to take that knight and say, okay, show that you can make me. And now the next move. Well, here's another opportunity for you. Can you find the next move here? This one is not easy to find at all. Okay, I'm going to give the answer away. It is knight to e4 check. So making use of that square anyway, even though it's guarded. And now the problem is that if white were to take the knight, which he didn't play, then this bishop comes back to d6. The knight was sitting on d6 before, so this move wasn't available. But with the knight out of the way, the bishop here on d6 is hitting the king, and the king has not got a single square to move to. Look at this. The queen's guarding all of these squares. The bishop's hitting there. This bishop's hitting there. The queen's guarding there. The king has no moves at all, and the only moves that can be made here just delay checkmate. This is actually a forced mate in 3. So that's the amazing thing about this tactic. So the knight can't be taken. The king runs back to h2. And then queen f4 check. King goes to g1. And then the game goes on for a long time. I'll include a pointer to the game if you want to see the conclusion. But the thing is that black has an overwhelming attack at this point. He's got... well, I'll give one more move. The knight hops back to g5, so black is no longer sacrificing 2 pieces, but only 1 piece. But he's weakened white's king side. These 2 pieces over on the queen side are still not playing. And I just want you to look at the placement of all of black's pieces. Notice how the rooks are on the open files adjacent to that isolated queen's pawn. He has the bishop pair. He has both bishops working. Looking at key squares on open diagonals, and he has his queen and his knight in the area around the king. And the combination of all of this is just going to be too much. Let's see. Yeah, and this bishop can reposition itself also. This bishop can come back here to d6. Another key idea to continue the attack. So that combination is deadly, and black went on to win that game. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. This game was played between Lev Polyagaevsky and David Bronstein in the USSR Championship in 1967. Actually, the championship is for the years 66, 67, so I guess the tournament started in 1966 and extended over into the new year, but the game was played in 1967. Polyagaevsky with the white pieces sets up a queen's gambit position, and David Bronstein replies with the Tarrasch defense again. And now it's white's turn to move in this position. Instead of taking the pawn, as we saw in the other games, Polyagaevsky plays the slightly more popular move, bishop to g5. So this is probably main line of the Tarrasch defense. And now there's 2 replies that black has. The main line continues with c4, which is a reasonable way to play. This move, bishop to g5, has added additional pressure on the center by threatening to take off that knight, which is one of the defenders of this piece. So it fits into this plan with white of just piling up on the d5 spot. And now this threat of actually taking the pawn and winning d5 is becoming a pretty significant one. So black needs to do something. So pushing this pawn forward, pushing the c pawn forward, or taking are the 2 main replies there. So Bronstein took, going for the isolated queen's pawn position. That's the second choice there, but quite respectable. But it gives Polyagaevsky kind of a leg up in the isolated queen's pawn defense here by giving a piece that blockades the pawn. Now, a blockader is double-edged in some ways. It can't be kicked from that square, so it's a good piece as long as it sits there, but it also blocks any attempt by white to attack that pawn. Because it sits, it's a shield for that pawn, as well as being a good square for that piece. It also acts as a shield for black's pawn, so it has 2 aspects to it. Anyway, Bronstein kicks the bishop first. The bishop doesn't want to trade itself for the knight at this point. It wants to just drop back, and then queen to b6. Putting a little more pressure on this blockader and asking Polyagaevsky what he wants to do about it. He could defend it, but I know this bishop might look a little awkward here, hemmed in by the pawns. So he decides to trade off, and we get this typical pawn structure transformation we've seen in other games. Queen goes over to c2. Now this bishop comes out to g4. This bishop drops back to e3, restraining the pawns. And right here, I was wondering about the move d4, but after d4, white can throw in the move knight to a4, kicking the queen away, and then just grabbing this pawn or moving the bishop, depending on how black responds. So d4 is not really a threat here. Bronstein played queen to a6, just getting out of the glare of the bishop. Now the bishop parks itself on d4, so a new blockader has been installed on the d4 square. Rook f to d8 was played here, getting behind that pawn. h3 kicking the bishop drops back to e6, more defense for the d4 point. If this pawn is well defended enough, then maybe that the push c4 can come along and Bronstein can go for the hanging pawns configuration and get some play out of it. This f rook was brought over to d1. This rook was brought to c8, preparing to push that pawn. This rook was brought to c1, and now knight to d7. Just piling up behind these pawns. And now Polyagaevsky chooses this moment to strike with the move e4, an interesting move, and not a bad move. So the formula that Nimzovich recommended for dealing with an isolated queen's pawn was restrain, blockade, and destroy. And so the blockader was this bishop. First it was the knight, now it's the bishop. And while that pawn is blockaded, you can counterattack it with another pawn because it can't move forward here and just bypass that pawn. So he's going for the destroy. I was wondering in this position, what about the move c5? It seems like maybe a counterattack and a way to save this pawn and push it forward and get a big pawn majority. Well, it's not a majority, but get a passed pawn here that's looking pretty dangerous. But that doesn't work out. After c5, what black plays is he ignores the threat to his bishop and takes here. And when you follow the complications through, it turns out that after all of these pieces are taken, white's going to get this pawn, black's going to get this pawn, but white has won a pawn. White emerges from that just a pawn up. So it's no good to push on with c5, which is what I would be tempted to play here. So he takes. Not much choice there. Too much pressure on the pawn. He has to give up his isolated queen's pawn. But there's a moment coming up here which is kind of interesting. So white takes back here, and Bronstein starts pushing his c-pawn forward. So in a way, he's kind of trading the c-pawn as an alternate to his isolated queen's pawn. Now he's got an isolated queen's bishop pawn, I suppose. Pushes it forward, knocks this bishop back. He plays bishop to f6, getting this on a good diagonal here. And freeing up this bishop to move if necessary. That bishop was loose on e7. This bishop dropped back to f1, hitting the queen again. And now pushing the pawn forward to c4. One question I had here was why doesn't white play b3 to try and undermine that pawn right away. But it turns out that after b3, black can take off the knight and then come in here with the queen. The knight was defending the a2 square. So b3 is just not quite working here. Rook to c2. Maybe that would prepare the move b3. And rook to e8, setting up a discovered attack on the queen. So rook c to d2 was played. And now Bronstein plays the very interesting move, bishop takes h3. But the probably the best way to proceed is just queen to a5. Just getting away from this pin, so he doesn't have to worry about b3, or if b3 is played, he can just take it. And this position is about equal to maybe a little better for black. So black has done a good job of working with his isolated queen's pawn, which is now it's an isolated queen's bishop pawn. It's a forward pawn here that's kind of hampering white's piece placement. Both sides still have the bishop pair, so there's no real material advantage, and all of black's pieces are very active. So slight edge to black here. Bronstein decides to complicate things by playing bishop takes h3. So, well, it's a tempo move. You can play this. Oh, I'm sorry. Instead of queen a5, leaving the queen here, playing bishop takes h3. Yeah, it's a move with a tempo on the queen. But it turns out that white can actually trade the queen for a couple of pieces. So best play for white would continue bishop takes h3, just getting that bishop back. Winning that bishop. And then after black takes the queen, then winning the rook. So it's a bishop and a rook for the queen. But the problem is there's more material to come because this knight is pinned to the rook and it's under fire. And there's no good way to save everything here. One of the better moves is just to move this rook aside, unpin the knight, and then bishop takes. We end up in this position where black has one extra pawn. There's 5 versus 4. But in exchange for the queen and the pawn, white has a rook and 2 pieces. So that's more than enough material. So white is just up materially and has no particular weakness that black can exploit here. So white's a little better in this position. Let me see. Another option, though, you might wonder why not, instead of giving up a whole piece, why not try to give up the exchange with a move like knight to b6? But there's some interesting tactics here. So the thing is that white can take off the bishop here with check. So that's all with tempo. And then grab this knight, trade this knight off, and then take the rook. So it's not winning. It's not giving up the exchange. It's actually giving up a whole rook because the queen cannot take back. There's a rook coming down here with check, picking up the queen. So at this point, it's 2 rooks and a bishop versus a queen and a couple of, still just 1 pawn. A queen and 1 pawn against 2 rooks and a bishop, and that's too much material. White is winning there. So he has to just give up the knight and play on in that position. Anyway, Polyagaevsky didn't quite calculate everything out. He traded in a different way. He threw in this move rook to d6, hitting the queen. This knight goes to b6 now, protecting the queen. The bishop takes on h3. So where is this? Oh yeah, grabs the bishop over here. And now rook takes queen, knight takes rook. Similar to the other line. Cancel that. He took here. Hitting the queen, trying to hit the queen with tempo. And the queen takes back. And the difference is the bishop is still alive and defending that square. Now the knight can grab this rook, hit the bishop, but the bishop can drop back to d7. And we can pause here. This rook just went back to d2 to defend. So now it's a queen versus 2 rooks. And then these 2 pieces are equal. 2 pieces versus 2 pieces, a queen versus 2 rooks. And it's actually a queen and a pawn versus 2 rooks. And in this kind of open position, the queen is pretty good. Maybe black's a little better. Maybe white can hold this. But Bronstein went on to win a long game from here. But anyway, I thought that was an interesting sequence. And let's take a look at the final game. This last game was played in the World Championship match between Tigran Petrosian and Boris Spassky in 1969. So Petrosian had the white pieces, Spassky had the black pieces, and we get a Tarrasch defense again. So it's Petrosian with white choosing the bishop g5 line here, just like the last game we saw, and Spassky choosing to take the pawn rather than push forward with c4. Just exchanges and allows the isolated queen's pawn position. Plays h6 to kick the bishop. Bishop drops back to e3. I'm going to go pretty quickly over the next 25 or 30 moves because I want to get to a critical position, but I'll make some commentary. We see a lot of typical isolated queen's pawn ideas as we go through the game. Mainly look at how active black's pieces are. He's just getting them all out there, and he's kind of poking and prodding at white structure, and eventually this pays dividends. It's kind of a slow process when you're playing such a strong player as Petrosian, but eventually it takes hold. And Petrosian plays in an interesting way, knight to b3. He's vacating that blockading square, but that does open up the line of attack. He's got 3 pieces attacking that pawn now, so the bishop drops back to e6. And so that's the trade-off. You can blockade the pawn, but sometimes you have to move out of the way if you want to directly attack it. Rook to c1 was played. Petrosian is no slouch. He's activating his pieces as well. Rook to e8, rook to e1, queen to d7, bishop to c5. Yeah, Petrosian at this point decides to trade off the dark squared bishops, which is probably a good idea from white's point of view. This dark squared bishop is black's most active bishop in this configuration because it's not hemmed in by the light squared pawn. Although this bishop can become very active too, either outside this on a different diagonal, or if this pawn gets pushed forward. It has potential to. It's not like it's a completely bad bishop, but still, this is probably a small victory for Petrosian to be able to trade off the dark squared bishops here. Now he plays e3, so this pawn is pretty securely restrained from being able to come forward. The rook comes to d8 to lend some defense. Queen goes to e2, getting away from the file the rook is on. Bishop to g4. And now we see the first maybe dividend that black's strategy is starting to pay. White kicks the bishop with f3, so starting to create a few pawn weaknesses. The bishop drops back to f5. Let's see, rook to d1, knight to e5, a little more maneuvering. This knight comes into d4, blockading the pawn again. Bishop to g6. The knight was hitting the bishop, so the bishop drops back. This bishop comes out to h3, poking the rook. The rook comes forward to c4. Once again, making use of these key squares that the dark squared isolated queen's pawn protects for black. And now g4. I'm not sure if this was strictly necessary, but this is another slight weakening of white's structure here. Maybe it keeps the knight from coming to the h5 square. It could be his idea, try and control some squares on the king side. But overall, this pawn structure is starting to look a little bit fragile. Let's see. Black goes rook b4, poking at this b pawn. Petrosian solidifies it with b3. This knight drops back to c6, taking a look at this knight here. Now there's some pressure between the rook and the knight. Queen comes to d2. Rook drops back to b6. Knight goes to e2. Knight c to e2, lending support to this knight. Bishop back to h7. Just some more maneuvering as far as I can tell. Bishop g2. Rook to e8. Knight to g3. And maybe that was the other point of pushing this g-pawn forward. It gives a square for the knight as well. And now finally Spassky goes for the exchange. He decides to take off this knight, the blockading knight, and allow this structure here with the pawns locked in. This is called the ram structure, the two pawns butting heads against each other. And rook to e6. He swings the rook over. That trade exposed his queen to an attack. So he brings the rook over. There's this trade. Queen takes. Rook to c1, grabbing the open file. Bishop back to g6. Bishop to f1. Knight to h7. So he got the bishop out of the way so we could do this knight maneuver. Maybe thinking about taking a look at this weakened f-pawn over here. Queen comes over to f4, holding on to things on the queen side. Knight routes around to f8. Rook to c5, putting pressure on this now blockaded queen's pawn. It's no longer an isolated queen's pawn. It's just a blockaded pawn. And let's see. Bishop to b1 was played. So the bishop goes all the way into white's camp, poking at this pawn over here, which comes forward. Another kind of weakening pawn push in a way, pushing these pawns forward. Now the knight comes out to g6, hitting the queen. Queen drops back to d2. Queen comes over to f6, taking a look at some of these pawns, and king to f2 coming up to defend the f-pawn, cancel f2, defending via f2. The knight goes to f4, great square for that knight, taking advantage of this little hole in white's structure. And now Petrosian makes the losing move, and right here, well, we're on move 38, so it's been a long game, and he may have just gotten worn out. May not have seen what was coming. It's a little bit hard to see this tactic that's coming, but he needed to play a defensive move like rook to c3. If you would get in a move rook to c3, black is better. White has these weaknesses, and black can continue to poke and prod for a long time, trying to find ways to gang up on them. But it appears that white can hold if he's pretty careful. And it's hard to say. Black has a lot of pressure. But this next move, a5, is definitely losing because of Spassky's next move. So if you're Boris Spassky, your turn to move with the black pieces. What's the strong move right here? Okay, this is a really tough one. I don't know if I would have gotten this, even with the hint that there's something going on in this position. I don't know if I could have found it. But if you want some time to work on it, go ahead and pause the video and think about this for a while. I'm going to give the answer away now. What Spassky played in this position, it's a great move. It's an interference move. Bishop to d3. So the bishop is just placed here, defended by the knight, but it's under attack from two pieces. The problem is that he can't take with the queen, and the king is under dire threat. The threat is queen takes d4 mate. It's not just check, it's mate. The king has no squares to go to. The knight is guarding all of these squares. The rook is guarding that square, and the queen would cover that whole diagonal. The rook is guarding this whole file. So that's a really deadly threat. And what can he do about it? It means, first of all, there's no time to take the bishop. And if he somehow managed to move a piece out of the way, give the king a square to go to, still queen d4 check would pick up the rook. The rook is loose after this pawn goes. So black is either mating or winning material or something here. What Petrosian tried, probably the best try in this position, is knight f5, just defending the pawn. And now Spassky comes up with another threat, queen to g5, threatening the loose queen with a discovered check. So knight there check, for example, would just pick up the queen. So Petrosian had seen this far ahead. He blocks with knight to e3, so there's no more discovered check. But now the queen comes in here with the check. The king drops back to g1, and Boris Spassky plays the final move of the game, bishop takes f1, and Petrosian resigns. So what's going on here? He's just won a piece. And if white takes it back with the knight, then the rook comes in here. Notice the rook supported by this knight, coordinating with the queen. Not on that square, on actually on the f2 square. The queen will come in here and deliver mate after this queen moves away, or white could give up the queen. But anyway, not looking good. Let's back up. If he takes with the king, the other way of taking the piece, this also loses because of queen here check. And now notice that the king can't go to any of these squares. Let's see. Well, he could go here, but then the queen here check looks pretty dangerous. The line that I was looking at was king here, queen takes, and now black wins material because of the pin on the knight. Let's see if I can figure out what happens if the king comes here. New variation, queen here, and he can't interpose with the knight because of this knight. So the king has to run here, and once again, well, there's this check, and once again he can pick up the pin knight here, regardless of where the king goes. So in any case, white is losing material if he's not getting mated after queen h3 check. So anyway, in this position, after bishop takes, and if he doesn't take back, then he's just down a piece, and he's still under attack, and he's losing in short order. So Petrosian resigned. Pretty nice finish to that particular game in the World Championship. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. That concludes my look at the offensive side, you might say, of the the isolated queen's pawn. In the next video, I want to start taking a look at how you play defense. How do you play against the isolated queen's pawn? So I will see you then. Bye.